I ended the last lecture module by suggesting that eliminative materialism isn't fundamentally different from the other views that we see emerge following the semantic twist in the 20th century. Indeed, like type identity theory or functionalism, eliminative materialists are attempting to understand the relationship between our ordinary or common sense talk about the mind and the scientific theories about the mind, specifically the monistic physicalist view about the nature of the mind that is emerging during this time. So eliminative materialism has the same basic conception of the theoretic problem in philosophy of mind in the 20th century, and it emerges at roughly the same time as functionalism. However, eliminative materialism has a much more amorphous history than the relatively straightforward and linear origin stories that we have with type identity theory and functionalism. The basic idea behind the eliminativist view had been in the air for some time in the 20th century before it crystallized into a theoretical movement. Many historians of philosophy attribute the view to James Corman's On the Elimination of Sensations and Sensation, published in 1968. Corman himself, however, attributes the view to William Van Orman Quine's Word and Object, published in 1960. The philosophers William Lycan and George Pappas attribute the view to Richard Rorty's Mind-Body Identity, Privacy, and Categories, published in 1965. The lineage that I prefer to trace through the history of philosophy begins with Wilfrid Sellars. In 1956, Sellars publishes Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind. In this book, Sellars argues against the notion that common sense discourse is somehow discontinuous with theorizing in science, suggesting instead that common sense is often supplanted by scientific theories as the result of a continuous progression of ideation and experimentation. On page 81-82 of that work, Sellars tells readers, scientific discourse is but a continuation of a dimension of discourse which has been present in human discourse from the very beginning. Then one would expect there to be a sense in which the scientific picture of the world replaces the common sense picture, a sense in which the scientific account of, quote, what there is supersedes the descriptive ontology of everyday life. I trace the lineage of the contemporary eliminative materialists to Sellars in part because Paul Churchland got his PhD from the University of Pittsburgh under the tutelage of Wilfrid Sellars, and he certainly seems to reflect a sympathy to the approach that Sellars describes in the passage I've just quoted. A similar pedigree can be established for Dan Dennett, who was a student of Quine as an undergraduate at Harvard and went on to get his PhD under the supervision of Gilbert Ryle. Perhaps the earliest expression of the eliminativist creed comes from two papers published by Paul Feyerabend in 1963. In 1963, Feyerabend publishes Materialism and the Mind-Body Problem, as well as a comment entitled Mental Events and the Brain. In those 1963 papers, Feyerabend proclaims the proper procedure for the monistic physicalist to adopt is to develop his theory without any recourse to existent terminology. The empirical character of his theory is not endangered thereby. After all, a physiological theory of epilepsy does not become an empty tautology on account of the fact that it does not make use of the phrase or the notion possessed by the devil here occurring in the theological sense. No matter who one associates with early expressions of eliminative materialism, there can be little doubt that the position rose to prominence and came to be associated with the University of California, San Diego, and three philosophers who spent the early 1980s there. It is these three thinkers, as well as Dan Dennett, that gave the view its modern formulation and its most rigorous defense. As the 70s end and the 80s begin, Paul and Patricia Churchland, Dan Dennett, and Stephen Stitch all published papers outlining and defending the view that our ordinary mental terms constitute a psychological theory, folk psychology. Dennett's Why You Can't Make a Computer That Feels Pain, published in 1978, Quine Qualia, published in 1988, and Consciousness Explained, published in 1991, are all classic articulations of the eliminativist view. Paul Churchland's Eliminative Materialism and the Propositional Attitudes, published in 1981, Reduction Qualia and the Direct Introspection of Brain States, published in 1985, are also considered to be classic expressions of eliminative materialism. Stephen Stitch's book, From Folk Psychology to Cognitive Science, The Case Against Belief, makes a case for eliminating the notion of propositional attitudes generally. Patricia Churchland's Neurophilosophy Towards a Unified Science of the Mind-Brain, published in 1986, also articulates and defends this view. Dennett expresses the view admirably in Quine Qualia as follows. Which idea of qualia am I trying to extirpate? Everything real has properties, and since I don't deny the reality of conscious experience, I grant that conscious experience has properties. I grant, moreover, that each person's states of consciousness have properties in virtue of which those states have the essential content that they do. That is to say, whenever someone experiences something as being one way rather than another, this is true in virtue of some property of something happening in them at the time. But these properties are so unlike the properties traditionally imputed to consciousness that it would be grossly misleading to call any of them the long-sought qualia. Qualia are supposed to be special properties in some hard-to-define way. My claim, which can only come into focus as we proceed, is that conscious experience has no properties that are special in any of the ways that qualia have been supposed to be special.